non-transient migrants the right to vote, we call the Prime Minister to open the debate.
Non-trans migrants need to vote. Who's going to raise their hand? Non-trans migrants.
There was a time in the civilized world when we thought that women did not have the right to vote. People always assumed them to be the other. People always assumed that they had different interests that would not be good for the society, that these differences we would not be able to reconcile with the way we want our society to work. But we think we were able to grant them the right to vote, not because we wanted to maintain these differences, but moreover, because we believe that they deserve that vote because of their inherent humanity, because of their utility to the state, and because they are socially accountable for the things that they do, which works both ways. And the state is accountable to them because they deserve to be protected by that same state that they are currently residing in. And we think that in today's world, in a more globalized context, we have to be more inclusive, especially when people move across borders. We do not want to commit the same mistakes that allowed members of society to fall within the cracks. This is why Proposition Side is extremely proud to forward this particular proposal. We want that in liberal democracies, that non-transient migrants who have stayed, at least in the United States, for around 4 years, which we think is reasonable for them to complete a single election cycle, for them to be there, and reasonably know how the state operates, their particular policies and things like that, to be able to grant them the right to vote. We think these people, when you characterize them, first of all, are not really Americans, nor do they want to be. But we think we need to give them that power to be able to affect change, because first and foremost, we don't think that the election, the ballot box, is a standard or a test of nationalism, but one that is a tool that is given to you to be able to get the rights and protection you deserve. Secondly, we say that these people have a broad number of reasons why they can't go home or why they still remain in that state. Maybe they don't have the money to go home. Maybe they don't have a home to go to. Maybe they do have long-term work commitments in that particular state. But the point is, regardless of these reasons, we think it's important for them to be able to get and demand that protection from the state. Thirdly, we say that we're only going to extend this policy to legal migrants. So if people cross the borders illegally, if people got on a boat, didn't declare themselves to that state, we don't think that these are people we extend that right to, because from the beginning, you're not recognized by the government. Fourthly, we're going to maintain that all other standards apply, i.e. you have to be 18 years old, you have to be able to read and write, you have to be legally accountable for all the things that you do. Two arguments for you today. First, on why they deserve the right to vote. Secondly, why the state needs to protect them, and why the ballot box is the exclusive way for the state to be able to do that. But sure.
When you're talking about protecting the rights of migrant workers, we think the status quo already accords several privileges to longer-term, non-transient migrant workers. So tell me exactly why the vote, a privilege reserved for citizens, have to be extended on the same level.
If you waited a little longer, I was going to get to, so please be patient. First argument, why we think they deserve the vote. In the first place, we think the standard of citizenship is a rather arbitrary one, because we think it's something that was accorded because of the birth lottery, because of where you were born, because of the people you were born to. And there's absolutely no guarantee that even if the state grants you citizenship, that you're going to become a productive or useful member of society, and that at the end of the day, these are still people who we allow to affect change. But conversely, we want to be able to extend that standard, because we don't think it's something that we should accord on luck alone. Let's take a look at these transient migrant workers, because we think that they've already proven that they want to and they have the capacity to be able to serve the state. In the first place, we say, let's take a look at how. First, you need an education to get a US visa, so we're not letting random idiots into our borders and filling out votes. Secondly, we think that they undertook a moral decision to leave, right? They waited against all their other options they had at home, all the other benefits and harms that they are going to receive in that country, so we think it was a rather calculated risk for them. Thirdly, most of the time they know they only have one chance to be able to make it big. They were leaving their family behind, they're leaving their previous lives behind. So we think that most of them come with good intentions to be able to make use of this huge investment they're making by transferring their lives from one state into one that has the possibility to grant them that opportunity. What is the point of all this? We think that we only waive the right to vote if you've proven to be treasonous, like you said don't want to be loyal to the state. Or for example, if you're a criminal, if you've committed a harm to the state, and the state says that you cannot be of any use to us. But we think, granted that these people have earnest intentions, granted that they mean well for the state, we think we still have to allow them to be able to vote. True, they might not have pledged allegiance, that they will fight your wars, that they will pay your taxes, and things like that, but we think they've met the minimum standards, i.e. I will come here and be of use. I will come here and not commit any crimes. I will come here and take jobs that nobody else here wants to be able to take. So we think that these are sufficient reasons for us to allow them. We think that they've invested enough in this particular state, and they're going to bear the accountability for the policies that they vote for, simply because they are locked in these particular states for the long term. So we don't think they're going to vote capriciously or vote without any accountability at the end of the day, because they're going to bear the brunt of all their particular outcomes. Secondly, but now let's talk about what Alvin raised a while ago, and why the state needs to protect them, and why it has to come through the vote. Because we think the vote is not a test of nationalism, i.e. you don't necessarily have to pledge a pledge of allegiance for you to be able to be entitled to vote, or for example, nor is nationalism a prerequisite for you to be able to vote. We think the ballot box is a utilitarian tool that the state accords for you to be able to forward agenda, for you to be able to make sure that the state understands and knows the demands that you are making of them. Because we think these transitory migrants have the same profile or identity as other minorities in the state. And we think that they have the same demands, or same needs that they have to be met. For example, demands about immigration and how their policies work. For example, about wages, welfare, social policy, and other anti-discrimination laws that they might want to forward, simply because they're already prejudiced for not being white, Caucasian, or natural members of that particular society. Because we think without the ballot box, these people are particularly invisibilized. Let's talk about the status quo. Because we think the way people look at these non-transit migrants is that you are just a hired gun. You're here to do your job, get in, get out, and you have nothing else. But we think in the interim, they don't just stay in their jobs while they're there. They also interact with the rest of society, and we think because they're treated as just hired guns, people look at them as second-class citizens, that you are only here because we are so gracious enough to give you here, and that we can discriminate against you, and because we can do that, we don't have any accountability towards you, because we refuse to grant the fact that you were supposed to have an accountability towards the rest of us in society. But second of all, because they're impermanent, because the state treats them as disposable, it's in nobody's interest at the end of the day to forward their particular rights, to make sure that their concerns are being heard. Which is why we don't think status quo is enough, because nobody has any damn incentive to make sure that these people are being heard, because they don't care about these people in the first place. Reason why we should allow them to vote is because we think it gives them the capacity to tell politicians what it is that they need. That they're no longer going to become invisibilized, that they are going to finally have that discursive mechanism to get the anti-discrimination laws that they want, to be able to get the better wages that they want, to be able to get the better immigration standards for them and the rest of their family to enjoy the benefits that they're receiving at the end of the day. And we think it's an extremely reasonable proposal for them, because they've proven that they deserve to be here, that they are better than a lot of the other people who were arbitrarily granted the right to vote. For all these reasons, we think the motion should stand. Thanks.
Thank Prime Minister for his speech. To continue the debate, we'd like to call Leader of Opposition.
We think it's telling when Job started his speech with an analogy between women in the past and women now, because we think that the divide that separates women in the past from the right to vote is not analogous at all to the divide that currently exists between citizens and non-citizens, because ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, let's be clear about one thing. This debate is about the proportionality of government recognition and conference of privileges proportional to the kind of investment and the kind of stakes that you have in a particular state. And we don't think, ladies and gentlemen, that Job has ever in his speech told you why is it necessarily that therefore, given that you're talking about non-transient migrant workers who have yet to become citizens, should therefore be accorded proportional and equal privileges with that of citizens, because ultimately the main difference is the vote in and of itself. Which is why the stance coming from opposition is simple. We think that the policy is unnecessary and unfair, especially when you're talking about the kind of problems that Job talked about. They can already be covered under status quo. Because we tell you about the status quo, we're talking about non-transient migrant workers, and we don't think it's just 4 years, right? We think it's like 10 or 20 years more, but if not 4 years, fine, easier for us. Even then, we think that really confers certain privileges and rights and state to these individuals because they are accorded status just one rank below citizenship. For example, we give you certain rights in exchange for taxation. We give you right to adequate protection, give you right to legal recourse, so on and so forth. So we say most of the benefits and privileges are already equitable to citizens and non-citizens alike. We don't think it's necessary to extend the vote to these non-transient migrant workers. I'm going to bring several substantive in my speech today. Rebuttals will be integrated. Firstly, I want to give you a characterization of the nature of non-transient migrant workers and tell you why they are not that similar to citizens who have a much more invested stake in these countries. Secondly, I want to talk about the privileges of citizenships. Are they really arbitrary? And even if they are, why is it that they can remain arbitrary in this sense? Thirdly, I want to talk about the impacts of their policy and why it feeds into xenophobia and why it undermines the integration and acceptance within society itself. First point, on the nature of non-transient migrant workers. And we agree to a large extent with Joe that ultimately we're talking about individuals who are heavily invested in their adopted countries. We're willing even to go so far as to say that these are citizens who may not even stay 4 years, but 10 or 20 years, and they invest millions of dollars and live for decades and pretty much resemble a lot like what your citizens are. But they are still different from citizens in that, ladies and gentlemen, they are and first and foremost, migrant workers, economic migrants, who make the very utilitarian calculus to come into a particular country, like Eduardo Savarin, who said, look, I want to come to Singapore because I think I'll be economically better off. The difference there, ladies and gentlemen, is that they make the decision based on the short to middle term, but not to the long term, in the cradle to the grave kind of calculus that citizens usually employ. But more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, the fact that they are non-transient migrant workers, given that you're talking about a time frame of 4 to 20 years, mean that usually when they're already there for that long, a certain state will already offer them the chance of citizenship. And most of them will already make the conscious decision to opt out of the citizenship, ladies and gentlemen. And this is indicative of the duality of vested interest, ladies and gentlemen, between the two states from which they come as a result. Therefore, we say that when you're talking about non-transient migrant workers, even in the best, most benign characterization that Proc can offer, maybe even Alan's speech, it is still not equitable and not similar to citizens in and of itself. This is it. Second, let's talk about privileges of citizenship. And the only thing we heard from Joe is this, that the standards of citizenships are arbitrary. No shit, Sherlock. Of course it's arbitrary, right? This is called the birth lottery. But ultimately, just because you are arbitrarily conferred citizenship still doesn't mean that we have to extend the same arbitrariness by giving citizenship privileges through voting to these non-transient migrant workers with a duality of interest. Why? Firstly, we say that citizenship are an exclusive privilege to those who are born here, or those who make the conscious decision to opt in after 10 or 20 years in those particular states. And we say that even as we consider the kind of extent of investment from non-transient migrant workers, that the extent of investment from citizens and adopted citizens extends beyond the utilitarian principle that's adopted exclusively by these permanent residents. We said the sense of rootedness and emotional ties, the way that you call this adopted country or your country home, the way that you extend those kind of emotional ties and familial relations with Calvin or Rebecca in Singapore is very different from say when Joe comes to Singapore to work in 10 or 20 years time. Therefore, we say, ladies and gentlemen, it exists on a completely different scale because you're talking about individuals, adopted citizens who make the conscious choice to take up citizenship. Is very different from the conscious choice to invest economically in a particular state. Ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, this has to be a balance, right? The government weighing the benefit of these economic migrants coming in vis-a-vis the benefits of me conferring a different asymmetrical status on recognition to citizens versus non-transient migrant workers. We think that we can still keep them here, reap the economic benefits of having more talented individuals come in without giving them the vote. The burden falls on that side to tell us why the vote is necessary to protect their interests. Yes.
You're being very inconsistent with your speech because if you're saying that these people are coming here to make 10, 20-year investments, how can you then say that they're only voting in the short term?
Okay, I think you shouldn't have to strawman my argument, right? I give you very, very detailed analysis on why is it that even though they're here for 10 to 20 years, that their calculus is one primarily based on utility. And therefore, it can never be steeped in the long term, from the cradle to the grave calculus that citizens employ. No, that is why when you're talking about the differences and the privileges of citizenship, you must understand the sanctity of the vote, which is to recognize the unbridled investment of citizens and adopted citizens into a particular construct. The idea is this: in exchange for you opting into a particular state, we give you this vote as a ticket to shape and determine your future because we recognize that there's no other way out for you other than to switch citizenship, which comes at a very, very high cost. That is why, ladies and gentlemen, we think that the vote has to be the facilitator of all other rights being actualized in a particular particular state. And more importantly, we think that the vote has to be given, ladies and gentlemen, as an indication of the complete and unquestioned loyalty from an individual in question into opting into a society. That is where you talk about Rebecca, who's a British citizen. Even though under British law, she can technically hold dual citizenship, she can only vote in one particular state of her residence or one particular state of her choice, because we recognize that your loyalty has to be undivided, and that is why she has still decided to relinquish her vote despite staying in Singapore for most of her life. That is the difference, and that is the sanctity of the vote that they must prove can be breached. Third thing, impact. We think fundamentally under your paradigm, you feed into xenophobia. Let's understand that this policy primarily takes place in countries with huge migrant population like Singapore. Under your paradigm, the government will be seen to be pandering to foreigners because you create suspicion by artificially elevating the status of foreigner, by giving them equal status with your citizenship. You feed the perception that these are higher class citizens because they can come into a particular country, abandon their citizen obligations like serving NS in Singapore, and then get away with it. And we think this kind of asymmetry is going to create a lot of negativity amongst perceptions on the ground. Secondly, you harm integration and acceptance, because right now acceptance towards other PR will be harmed because all PRs will be labeled under the blanket that you want to be equal as us and therefore I hate you. Secondly, more importantly, for those PRs who choose to adopt citizenship, now the bar is lowered and you allow their sacrifice, their conscious choice to opt in, to be trivialized by the majority who says that, oh, you're given the right to vote even if you didn't decide to be a citizen anyway. And we think that's harmful to the ability of them to be recognized and accepted from all people on the ground. For those reasons, we oppose.
Take leader of opposition for his speech. To continue the debate, we'd like to call Deputy Prime Minister.
If we gave these non-transient migrants all the rights of every other citizen, then they might be right in saying that it wouldn't be fair because we make them equal to every other citizen. But the fact that the only right that we're giving them is the right to vote and not an American passport, not the symbolic idea that you are an American, not the idea that you must be bound to that state and you are given so much other protections, we think, Mr. Speaker, is a totally fundamentally different case that they're making. Firstly, I want to go through a number of rebuttals before I go on to the idea that rights of citizenship are divisible because of the sole idea that citizenship in itself is a social construct which aims to serve utilitarian purpose, and why if you don't divide it in this particular instance, you do not reap that particular benefit, the benefit which was supposed to come with the concept of citizenship. Firstly, they say that the reason why we can't give them rights is because they are migrant workers. This in itself is bigoted, Mr. Speaker, because it in itself sort of implies that they are evil, implies, Mr. Speaker, that they are selfish. But on the second idea, they say that their decisions are made on a short-term decision. Mr. Speaker, when you are born as an American, you did not even make a decision. You were just born into that reality, and we think that as far as accountability and decision-making is concerned, it's even so much less on their part. But thirdly, the idea that we are talking about non-transient workers, when Job already characterized that many of these people choose to stay forever, or if they don't choose to stay, have no other choice but to stay, Mr. Speaker, means that when they vote, they will not be voting based on short-term decisions anyway. But lastly, the idea that they just came there on a whim. We totally disagree with this idea that, you know, one day I just decided I want to be American and it was so easy for me to get there. If you characterize the reality of what kind of people are really entering America, these are individuals who in their own states, Mr. Speaker, are disincentivized and don't have a lot of capacity to make these types of decisions. So when they do, they work hard for it, Mr. Speaker, and we think it's very difficult for them to just risk it or sacrifice it. Second, they say, Mr. Speaker, that many are already offered citizenship but opt out, and that's the reason why our policy is unnecessary. First of all, this doesn't reflect the reality, Mr. Speaker, that so many people who want to become citizens don't have access to become citizens. In fact, many of us want to go to America, but we're even denied visas, Mr. Speaker, to go to that country, even if we want to be tourists or what have you. What is the point? This argument totally disregards the mass majority of non-transient migrant workers who are not being given access to citizenship. But let's argue that even if they didn't want to be citizens, right? They didn't want the passport, they didn't want to make that Pledge of Allegiance. The question is there still a value in hearing them out? Are they still not people that deserve to be protected? And will the state not still be safer knowing, Mr. Speaker, their input? And is it not the state's responsibility anyway to protect them, even if they don't want to fight your wars, even if, Mr. Speaker, they don't want to hold your passport? Thirdly, they say that the extent of investment or rootedness of Americans are different. This is the most massive and poorest assertion that will be made throughout this entire debate. Because the idea that America is already a melting pot, the idea that maybe half of Americans aren't even white anymore, we think, Mr. Speaker, begs us to question, what does it really mean to be an American? And is it not, Mr. Speaker, in line with the spirit of a liberal democracy that people, even if they were not born there, Mr. Speaker, could be or want that particular identity? But more importantly, when we talk about wars, for example, when we talk about how much sacrifice do Americans really make, we have to ask ourselves, I wonder why there are so many non-transient workers anyway. Maybe it's because these individuals don't even want to take the jobs, Mr. Speaker, that their state is offering them. Maybe so many people are so freaking lazy, Mr. Speaker, that you have a lot of people from other countries coming in. What is the point? If these Americans love their country so much to the point that they were taking all the jobs that were there to begin with, then maybe you would have an argument. But the fact that that isn't true begs us to question how invested really are Americans, and even if they were invested, where is the bottom line, or what standard, or where is your standard to say when it is enough? We would say, Mr. Speaker, the fact that you are serving, the fact that you are paying your taxes, the fact that you've been living there as a good citizen already proves a decent amount of investedness in the American community. Next, they told us that votes are given because there are no other options for Americans. And the reason why we must grant it to Americans is because unlike other people, they have no other options. Mr. Speaker, if we were to compare, Americans have more options most likely than people from the third world. It is Americans, Mr. Speaker, who could really and easily choose to leave, Mr. Speaker, choose to change citizenship. So the idea, Mr. Speaker, that this is true is false. But more importantly, this doesn't respect the idea wherein we told you many workers go there and are trapped, Mr. Speaker, because they know they can't go home, because the idea that they have to keep sending money back home. So what is the point? The point is, Mr. Speaker, many non-transit workers also feel they have no other option but to stay there. In that instance, are they not the same with Americans that we should allow them to shape their society since they will be there for the rest of their lives? This last idea, Mr. Speaker, the idea that what we're doing if we have this policy is artificially place people on a pedestal. The idea that we're not giving them more votes, or the idea that we're not giving them even the same rights, Mr. Speaker, makes this a very appeal to emotion type of argument. But more importantly, they say the problem with this is that it dilutes the value of people who worked hard. First of all, we don't think this is true. Everyone who wants to apply to become a citizenship under this policy would have had the right to vote even before they became a citizen. So as far as all migrants are concerned, we think we are all granting them an equal opportunity to use this right even if or even before they became an American citizen. Before I move on, yes.
Recognizing that these non-transient migrant workers are invested, we told you that the degree of investment is still different because theirs is based primarily on utility and your utilitarian calculus. Deal with the argument.
Okay, so are you telling me that every single American wants to serve the military? Like every single American wants to die for his country. No offense to the South Koreans, but many of them leave their country because they don't want to participate in the military, and yet we still grant them so many rights. This is so arbitrary, Mr. Speaker, and we think that is fundamentally unfair. Rights of citizenship and the idea that they are divisible. We think citizenship is a social construct, and the idea that rights of citizenship aren't universal across all states means they vary depending on what best serves the nation, right? Like in America, you have more rights, for example, than in non-liberal states or in third world states. The point, Mr. Speaker, is that if you look at the rights in America, you have rights to permanent residency. You give rights, Mr. Speaker, not necessarily equal to citizenship, but things close to citizenship, and we think that what we can do is divide these rights. What our policy does is similar, Mr. Speaker, in the idea that we're not granting you a full citizenship, but we're granting you the particular right to vote, not only because, Mr. Speaker, you've chosen not to accept every other right, but the idea that the vote in itself and granting these people the right to vote itself serves a purpose. What is that purpose to which we think that they have had no response for? The idea, Mr. Speaker, that many OFWs, migrant workers, and what have you, are constantly being discriminated on the ground. The idea, Mr. Speaker, that even as people, they're the ones facing the harshest work conditions, the lowest labor, and things like that. Your policy allows them to remain invisibilized, and what you're saying is, well, there are other alternatives. Well, they could become citizens. Well, Mr. Speaker, what if they don't want to become citizens? What if they cannot become citizens? We think this does not preclude their right to protection. This does not preclude their right to a safer society. Xenophobia is a problem on their side. But we think xenophobia is a greater problem when they know, and when Americans know, that that migrant workers have a large reason to want to hate Americans, or have a large reason to be insecure against other Americans. We grant them the right to vote. We equalize society and create a better one. Thank you very much.
Thank Deputy Prime Minister for his speech. To continue the debate, we'd like to call Deputy Leader Rebuttal.
Yes. I think we need to be extremely clear here. If a South Korean decides that he does not want to serve national service and leaves the country, he is no longer considered to be someone that subscribes to the collective conscience of a citizen, and therefore no longer would receive the right to vote. It is simply treasonous. It's called being a defaulter in countries that require conscription and national service. We think citizenship is accompanied by many obligations that you have to serve to your state. We also believe that there should be an unfettered commitment, one that we cannot doubt, from our citizens in order for us to recognize them in the ultimate power of democracy, the ability to shape public policy, the ability to shape the way in which the country is run. We don't think we can guarantee that from the position of migrant workers, and therefore we think that we should err on the side of caution and not give them the right to vote. I want to look at a couple of points of rebuttal. The first thing I want to look at is this idea about the vested stake and where do we recognize citizens and how do we draw those distinctions and why does right to vote exist. If you really look at what they told us, they seem to be telling us that, just simply because of the fact that they work here, the fact that they pay taxes and follow the law, they deserve a right to vote and they have interest. We recognize all of that, but we don't think it's sufficient. Why is that so? Because many of these citizens, things that they describe, which I want to point out, there's a very confused characterization of what their migrant workers they're referring to. Because on one hand, they're referring to smart, educated fellas who live in the suburbs, the rich suburbs of America. On the other hand, they're telling us they're workers who work in extremely poor conditions. We think they're two separate populations. We think the kind of population you're looking at is more likely the richer middle class workers because they're non-transient in nature. Most construction workers are transient in nature and therefore don't fall under this entirely. But then let's look at this more specifically in more analysis, right? We think that many of those people who are quite rich make the active opt-out choice not to become a citizen. They tell, if you're rich enough, if you're educated enough, and you've worked in the country for long enough, then you can undergo citizenship tests, then you can make the choice to become a citizen if you want to. The fact that these people make an active choice to opt out from that system leaves us a doubt that they are loyal to us, a doubt that they would sacrifice their lives in times of war and not run out of the country when we enter war, when we are drafted, when our children are drafted, when our children die. We think that there's a means by which, and in essence, we do need to recognize that calculus that they are making, and because there is that doubt, we do have to recognize that citizenship has some exclusivity attached to them, and they must give something back in return. Following the law and paying taxes is not enough, because that is not painful. We think ultimately the rootedness of individuals should be proven. We think you cannot guarantee that unless they go through citizenship tests, unless they pledge the oath of allegiance, and therefore, your point doesn't stand. No. And then they looked at this second idea, which is this need to protect people because, you have interests, like for instance, you get exploited at work, etc., etc. We think that existing means by which democracies, especially those in this debate that you're looking at, have areas and channels by which you can make your claims and make your interests heard, right? So you can go through the courts if you feel that your labor has been exploited. We think there's existing labor law in developed economies that will be able to help you there. We think there are NGOs that can be able to help you there. We think the media particularly helps you there. But more than that, also, we want to argue a logic. We want to argue that economic interests of the receiving states of these migrant workers have an interest to protect the interests of those people already in the existing electorate. Meaning if you're a rich investor or you're a rich, skilled worker, skilled lawyer, etc., and you come into a country like Singapore, we have every interest to make it comfortable for you. We have every interest to make you feel like you want to come to our country, which is particularly what we do in our country, the status quo. We have preferential tax exemptions for dual taxation in many countries. We have housing subsidies for our permanent residents, although I'm not so sure I agree with that fully. But then the point is we do incentivize these people to come in, especially those who are non-migrant workers, and therefore you do need to recognize that we already have policies and mechanisms in place in the status quo, in the due process that says that. What we don't think they recognize is this argument of xenophobia that Alvin argued. Existingly, there is a rhetoric that these people are coming into our country, they take our jobs, they take our resources, they make our lives difficult. It's important there for us to recognize that by giving the right to vote, the absolute power of democracy, you are essentially sending a message. You are telling your citizens that these PRs and these permanent residents have absolutely the same rights accorded to you and are equivalent to you. We think that's horrible because what happens as a result is you feed into the rhetoric of xenophobia, you make it much more harder for them to get integrated, you make it much harder for immigration policies to be reduced, you make it more harder for their lives, right? We think, but precisely because they are perceived to be outsiders with personal conflicts of interest, with no commitment of loyalty, and they potentially can meddle in our state. We think that's bad. No. Let's look at the next thing, which is the substantive or extension that we want to provide here. We think particularly you hurt migration policies, even coming from sending countries, when you have something like citizenship, so powerful draw given out, right? Because what you observe in developing societies is an increasing movement towards state ethnocentrism, right? They want to protect their brains, they want to protect their resources, especially in the context of who we're talking about, right? So given that they now, in the status quo existingly, they recognize that these people are still outsiders, it's okay to send them as outsiders into those countries in order to interact and have remittances back. The moment you give citizenship, the moment you give the right to vote, you're essentially empowering those people and you create a perception of an eroded rootedness of that citizen. Therefore, you prompt countries to be more prohibitive in the way in which you let people out in their countries, but you disagree.
In status quo, xenophobia already exists, but because they have no vote, it's very difficult and there's no incentive for politicians to take care of them. At least in our policy, it aims to solve these things. How does status quo do that?
It's far worse under yours the moment you tell them that they're equal, because everyone will start getting mad. The precise reason why they're mad in the first place is because there's an irrational belief that they're coming in to invade our country. With regards to the second part of your POI, we think the rational economic calculus that states make on their own already serves as a check and balance. We think that's possible. But let's look at this thing, right? So why does countries who send out these migrants will become more prohibitive in the way in which they let people out? So countries like China will believe that the moment they let any person out, that person will have the right to vote and therefore fix all his assets and everything else and commit them abroad. We think that prevents people from getting out of their countries then. So that's bad. But on the level of receiving countries, we also believe you hurt the political will in order for these countries to want to receive them in the first place. Because at the very same hand, you have to recognize that the moment you let them in to vote, right, and to vote in your country, means that you're letting in a voting bloc. And this voting bloc basically entails diluting your existing electoral base. The problem with that is that countries will become a lot less receptive to the idea of receiving these migrants. Therefore, what results as a result of this is an economic inefficiency, where structural unemployment gets feeded in or gets ignored, right? So especially when these people can't make it into those countries and you can't allow and lax the immigration law because of the reason that the xenophobia and the kind of political obstacles that exist then. So at the end of the day, we recognize that giving the right to vote here does far more harm than good, is principally unfair and unjust, and that is why, ladies and gentlemen, we are extremely proud to oppose.